Hi friends, Tracy here to tell you that making a podcast is hard work. There's research, scripts, editing, and all of that can mean a million decisions. Fortunately for me, my choice in a podcast hosting platform was easy because I decided upon Anchor by Spotify. If you haven't heard about Anchor by Spotify, it's the easiest way to make a podcast with everything you need all in one place. Let me explain. Anchor has tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. When hosting on Anchor, you can distribute your podcast on listening platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcast, and more. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. And best of all, Anchor is totally free. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started on your podcast today. Welcome to Crescent City Crime, dear listeners. I'm Tracy.
And I'm Brian.
And thank you to everybody who has been listening to us. We really appreciate you making us a part of your lives.
Yes, thank you for listening. We really enjoy doing this. Yes. It's all about our listeners.
It is all about our listeners, and it makes me feel good that we're finally, well, I wouldn't say finally, because we've been doing this for a little while, but I'm very glad that we were able to launch this project.
With me too. This has been fun. This has been really worthwhile.
Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad my idea is good for both of us.
Most definitely.
Yes. And of course, we want to thank you to Lucy, who runs our TikTok.
Thank you, Lucy.
Yes. And we are recording on a very interesting day. This is a day that will live in infamy. This is a day that a former president's house was raided by the FBI. And I'm sure that many of you are wondering what could Trump possibly be charged with. And Brian, you had a good explanation for this earlier. So could you please, since you are smarter than the average bear, please tell everybody what you told me.
Well, supposedly some information classified, secret, has been found at Mar-a-Lago. And if that is true, then someone is guilty of removing classified information from a secure area.
Right. And what exactly is the charge? It's not espionage, because we went over that. Or it could
probably not.
Yeah.
Okay, now if there is someone on that premises who is later identified as a foreign agent, or have had contact with a foreign agent, then espionage is possible.
Right.
But it is a federal crime to remove classified information from a secure area. It's it's kind of illegal, and if you're authorized to handle classified information, you're already well aware of this.
Yes. And you had mentioned something about when you're in the Marine Corps, you had to be searched when you left a certain area.
Yeah, third floor, Tactical Logistics Office, TACLOG for short, of headquarters, 7th Marine Expeditionary Brigade at Marine Corps Base 29 Palms. When I was assigned to the Tactical Logistics Office, which was boring as all hell, and it had secret cover sheets and classified cover sheets, confidential, and leaving work every day. I didn't like bringing anything with me to work because you had to submit to a search when you leave. Because when you come down from the elevator and go to the security desk, you'd exchange your security ID for your military ID. Just like when you checked in, you would give them your military ID, and then they would give you your security ID. And then you'd go to your work area. You see?
Right.
And I didn't always like leaving there for lunch, because then you had to get in line to be security screened to leave.
Right.
You see, And so oftentimes we were lucky enough to be able to get those white boxed lunches brought to us.
Gotcha.
Especially if something was going on. Like I can remember before deployment to at the time Desert Shield. We were working 12 hours on, 12 hours off, and we didn't leave the building for lunch. Our boxed lunches were brought to us. But that's another story.
Well, yes. So I'm sure that, like many of our listeners, well, no, I kind of fumbled that sentence. I myself, like many of our listeners, are going to be watching this avidly. I cannot wait to see what comes out of this.
This is going to be very interesting, to say the least. This is looking to be just as controversial as Watergate, of course.
Except Watergate did not have a warrant to go into those offices and steal those documents.
Well, you're talking about a burglary.
Yeah, right.
Okay. That was a burglary. We're talking about like level of controversy here.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes.
Right.
Well, actually, no, I'm wrong, because here's the thing: Watergate was a burglary, right? Well, you could argue that Trump stealing documents from the White House is also a burglary.
No,
not
really. He was that was his workspace. If Trump or someone who had associated with Trump removed those documents from their work area, whoever did is guilty of
malfeasance.
You could call it malfeasance, but it's
worse.
It's worse than malfeasance. I mean, if you have a security clearance, you know darn good and well that's one of the very basic things. You cannot remove classified information from a secure area.
Apparently, you can't flush them down the toilet either.
Yeah, that's also illegal.
Yeah, but there are pictures of documents floating in a White House toilet.
I really have no words for that.
Well, neither do I, except I'm just waiting to see how this all plays out. And may the DOJ finally get that son of a bitch. And that's all I'm going to say about this topic today. Because we do have an actual main topic. And I do want to warn our listeners at this point, if you're sensitive to the topics of child rape, you may bow out now. We will, of course, handle this as sensitively as possible, like always, but it is going to get mentioned. So, 100 miles north of Louisiana is St. Helena Parish, and within that parish is the town of Greensburg, Louisiana, and the town has a population of about 600 people. This is a little town that's far away from the big city. Murders and other violent crimes, they just don't happen in Greensburg. But on November the 12th, 1979, a teenage John Doe was found in the Greensburg garbage dump. The boy was slightly built, with long blonde hair and blue eyes. He wore shoes that were too big and on the wrong feet, oversized pants, and a black t-shirt with the phrase "sex is better than weed if you have the right pusher" on the back. He was hog-tied, and in a cruel manner, the rope was also tied around his neck. So when the boy struggled, the rope would tighten around his neck and slowly strangled him to death. But there was no evidence of sexual assault. Nobody in Greensburg recognized him, and nobody came forward to claim the body. So town residents took up a collection to have the body buried in Pine Hill Cemetery in a metal box. And the tombstone read, "Unidentified homicide victim." It would take over 20 years and the determination and skill of a detective and a medical examiner to finally identify the Greensburg John Doe. Before the discovery of the Greensburg John Doe, 2 other bodies were found in 1978. They were tied up in the same manner. They had the same hairstyles and body types. Dennis Turcotte's body was discovered on February the 3rd, 1978, in the woods of St. Tammany Parish near Abita Springs. This location is about 45 minutes from the French Quarter. Dennis was 19. Dennis was 19. The next month, 17-year-old Raymond Richardson was found near the I-10 in Pass Christian, Mississippi. And Pass Christian is about an hour away from New Orleans. Now, a Greensburg native named Dennis Stewart was just 9 years old when the young John Doe was found in a garbage dump. While the murder was the talk of the small town for a while, eventually interest in the case waned, and it seemed like it was forgotten about by everyone except for Dennis Stewart. When Dennis Stewart became an adult, he joined the Louisiana State Police, and in 1995 he earned the rank of detective. It was during this time that he was able to turn back to the gruesome slaying that rocked his hometown. As a child, Dennis Stewart couldn't believe that a boy could be killed and not be missed. It was this thought that motivated him to finally identify John Doe. Brian, we finally have somebody who became a cop for the right reasons.
Well, actually, there's my experience. There's quite a few cops who do that.
Right.
It's just that they tend to only make the news for they tend to not make the news.
Right.
Okay. Bad cops make the news, of course. There are good cops who make the news, and some of those cops are the kinds who join for the right reasons. Yes.
Right.
But they tend to not be really high profile types. They just don't really get noticed that well. Not as much as bad cops get noticed, unfortunately. And I mean, yes, it's another topic, but also the cops who join for the right reasons tend to get picked on by rank and the internal affairs types. You see, but that's a whole other topic,
which we will eventually talk about on a different episode. But Dennis Stewart said that I thought from the beginning that the chances of me finding the party responsible was going to be limited, but I thought that maybe I could identify the boy. When Detective Stewart looked over the evidence, he discovered that dental impressions had not been taken. DNA was not in use in 1979, so there was there was nothing collected. And there were no samples to run. Fingerprints were taken, but in the 1970s, computer usage within law enforcement was still very early in its infancy. So databases were not complete. But in the book Trail of Bones, more cases from the files of a forensic anthropologist by Dr. Mary H. Mannheim, it is explained that in 2000, Detective Stewart had received an inquiry from a woman who thought that the Greensburg John Doe could be her son. Due to that inquiry, Detective Stewart was able to get an exhumation order from a judge. Dr. Mannheim also explained that the metal box that contained the remains of John Doe was rusted and full of holes. Water had leaked into the box and mud was mixed in with the remains. And at first it did not look promising. The bones had been largely damaged by water and turned soft. However, once Dr. Mannheim was able to dry and clean the remains properly, she discovered that the teeth were preserved. X-rays showed that the teeth were still in the sockets and that there were fillings. So they were able to extract DNA from those teeth and they had them tested. Unfortunately, the Greensburg John Doe was still not identified after this process, but in 2008, a colleague of Detective Stewart's suggested that he just submit the fingerprints into APHIS, which is the FBI's integrated automated fingerprint identification system. And guess what?
But
The prints returned a match. It was as simple as a fingerprint check. At last, a name could be put to the John Doe, and the identity is Daniel Wayne Dewey. Daniel Dewey was arrested in 1979 in Baytown, Texas, for riding a motorcycle without a helmet or an operator's license. Lieutenant Doug Kane II had nothing but praise for Detective Stewart, saying that he did most of the work on his own time. He kept at it, and it was like a puzzle he couldn't stop worrying about. So Detective Stewart did get high praise from a lieutenant.
oh, how about that?
Yeah, how about that?
Yeah, that's nice.
Finally.
Yeah,
And yes.
that certainly wasn't my experience in police work, but hey, sometimes some people, some good people do get their due.
You're right. Well, once the identification was made, Detective Stewart was able to locate Daniel's brother, Billy, who lived in Texas. Billy spoke openly about the rough upbringing he and his two brothers had. Their mother died in a car accident when Billy was 7 and Daniel was 6. The boys were shuffled around to various relatives and did not see each other often. And the last time Billy saw his brother was the day that Billy graduated from high school in May of 1979. So this is a long time not to know what happened to your family member. They only identified this boy in 2008, and the last time his brother saw him was in 1979.
That is a very long time.
Yes, and Danny was a junior in high school the last time that Billy saw him. And the people that they lived with moved the next day. So Danny and his brother were homeless.
Wow.
And the last time that Billy saw Danny, he was getting on a bus. But he said that when he was informed of his brother's death, he said that it was a relief, and then he found out how he died, and then he became sad along with feeling relieved. And he says, I can't get the way he was tied up out of my mind and the lonely way he died. The remains of Daniel Dewey at long last were claimed by his family. He was cremated and taken to his hometown in Ponca City, Oklahoma in 2008. So after 29 long years, Daniel Dewey was properly laid to rest and honored by his family. Even though the mystery of his identity was finally solved, the question of who killed Dennis Turcotte, Raymond Richardson, and Daniel Dewey still lingers today in 2022. Physical similarities aside, they had worked at the same place and likely knew each other. They were employed at a now defunct restaurant on Royal Street in the French Quarter named Jimmy's Coney Island Hot Dog Stand. Do you remember that place?
I sure don't.
Okay.
No, like the only hot dogs I associate with the French Quarter, of course, are the Lucky
Dogs.
Lucky Dog carts.
Okay, yeah.
The only time I ever ate a Lucky Dog was on the set of the movie Renfield when it was filming in the French Quarter, when they paid Lucky Dog to have one of their vendors in their carts as part of a scene, and the nice perk was that included hot dogs. And that was my first Lucky Dog ever, and I wound up having 3 of them over the course of the movie shoot for Renfield that day.
Okay.
Wasn't the only day I worked on Renfield, but it had that nice perk, Lucky Dogs.
Okay, well, I'm assuming then that this, because I did try to find out when this hot dog stand closed down. I couldn't find any information. So it's entirely possible it didn't even last very long. It might have just been a flash in the pan kind of place.
Yeah, that's the first talk I ever heard of that one.
Well, these boys were also gay. And even though back in the 1970s they were referred to as hustlers, these days we would call them what they actually were, which are sex trafficking victims. And this is likely why the cases went cold. as the 1970s and 1980s were especially rough decades for gay men. Frank Perez, who is a longtime neighborhood resident and historian of the New Orleans LGBTQ community, describes the gay dating and sex scene in the 70s and 80s as very active but still very closeted. During the 1970s, there had been a series of extremely violent killings in the French Quarter. Several men were beaten to death with a hammer, and the killings were never even investigated. To make matters worse, police were also not investigating the arson that had destroyed the upstairs lounge that resulted in the deaths of 32 people in 1973. So, business as usual, right? Just, people can just be killed with hammers and in a fire, and it's okay.
The NOPD was definitely still anti-gay. And revisiting something similar to what I've said on one of our earlier podcasts, at the very least, you would want to take someone who is that horrible off of the street, because quite frankly, if you can dehumanize anyone who is innocent and murder them, then you can dehumanize and murder anyone.
That's true.
Okay, and I mean, adding insult to injury, of course, these people have already dehumanized themselves as well. You see, so these are not the kinds of people you want out there in the street. Therefore, even a police officer who does not like the LGBTQ community should be dedicated to taking someone like that off the street, because they're not fit to be in society, since they're able to just so easily harm innocent people.
Exactly. And in a more succinct manner, thank you, Frank Perez said the police just didn't give a fuck. That is a direct quote from Mr. Frank Perez. It would take years for attitudes to change. But in 1977, Louisiana State Police made it a priority to solve the deaths of Dennis Turcotte, Raymond Richardson, and Daniel Dewey. As recently as 2019, Louisiana State Police announced that there was renewed interest in the cases. Even though officials have not yet publicly stated that there is any new evidence, a new look at a cold case starts with the processing of new evidence like fingerprints or DNA. And even though no suspects have been publicly named, rumors have long swirled around a disgraced NOPD detective named Stanley Burkhart.
Oh yes, we talked about him. We talked about the fire at that club, the arson, right?
No, Stanley Burkhart. We're gonna actually get into who he is next week, but I brought him up to you before, but don't say anything on the podcast this week, because I'm laying out the groundwork this week. You see, this is a 2-part episode. Surprise. Yeah. But Stanley Burkhart was a sex crimes detective, and there's a possibility that he had something to do with the deaths of those boys.
Oh yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. I remember.
Now you remember. Yes.
Yeah.
So, Brian, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up officially today? Because my final thoughts are that I am thankful for people who go into law enforcement for the right reasons. Because if not for the detective who stuck through this case and identified Daniel Dewey, we might not even have any clue as to a connection with those other 2 boys.
It's commendable, that level of dedication. But that should actually be closer to the norm.
It should be. You're right.
And I mean, once again, I've talked about this before. It's very disappointing to me that there are a number of law enforcement officers out there who simply just want a paycheck and benefits.
Right. They don't actually want to do the work.
Yes, there's like some of the top brass in the New Orleans Police Department, one of whom, a certain director of PR who retired a few years ago, who bravely led an anti-prostitution raid on Tulane Avenue.
Oh, no, not the sex workers.
After making a career of ducking and dodging real law enforcement and taking the easy way out every step of the way so that
you can name names.
So that he wouldn't have any disciplinary action on his record.
You can name names. You don't have to say a certain whoever.
His initials are MD. I'm going to leave it like that. And
yeah, for legal reasons, maybe you really should.
He tried to get a friend of mine on the force fired, and then during MD's retirement process, he actually apologized to my friend for doing that, since he had some kind of conscience about him. And good riddance, because MD didn't really enjoy doing real police work.
I tell you, though, I also think that the higher up you get, the more you let it go to your head and the more corrupt you can become.
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately.
A certain high-ranking police officer who's no longer in the NOPD once said, "What good is power if you're not going to abuse it?"
Abuse it, but not use it, right?
Right,
yeah.
right.
Yeah, unfortunately, not every police officer is Olivia Benson. It's not a TV show.
No, unfortunately not. There's a low percentage of officers out there who are no good. And I do emphasize, yes, it's a low percentage of police officers who are like that, but they do tend to get noticed.
Well, I mean, yeah, except that there's a whole ass police department in Texas who shall remain nameless, or my head might explode because it makes me so angry to think about, who should all just be fired. Every last one of them.
Cowardice, pure cowardice.
Yes.
And I can say that with firm conviction because I'm a Marine Corps combat veteran.
I mean, I've never put myself in front of a gun or anything like that, but there have been times when I've risked injury to myself to help somebody else. It has happened.
Yes, I've done that. I've done that as well, and you've witnessed that. But my succinct point on those certain officers in Texas is essentially this: thousands of teenagers during World War II stormed beaches in the Pacific and on shores in France, going up against thousands of trained teenagers defending those shores with military weapons.
Right.
Okay? But it seems none of these officers could storm that school and go after one armed teenager with civilian weapons, okay, and do what had to be done. Ridiculous. But
yes, and I just want to also mention that my grandfather was a teenager during World War II, and he was a POW in a Japanese prison camp, and he survived.
Yeah, he was captured at Wake Island.
Which for him to survive that took a lot more guts than the entire police department of Uvalde, Texas has.
Yes, and being the youngest born in my family, yes, I have a father who stormed the beaches at Saipan as a United States Marine as a combat engineer, which meant he carried a .45 pistol and a flamethrower. And yes, he had that courage too. And he would have been in that school in nothing flat. Being, let's say, if he would have teleported that teenager from World War II, he would have been the first one in that school.
All right. Well, on that very brave note, we're running out of time. So, dear listeners, be safe, be kind. Remember that we're all human beings, and don't park next to vans.
If it's dark, it's dangerous, you don't feel safe, don't be there in the first place. And if you are talking to law enforcement in an official capacity and you are not the witness to a crime or the victim to a crime or assisting law enforcement in apprehending a fleeing felon, lawyer up.